The morning sun cast long shadows across the small apartment as Nancy Thompson stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. 6 years of military service had left their mark, not just in the perfect posture she still maintained, but in the quiet determination behind her eyes. After 3 tours in Afghanistan, being back in Phoenix felt like stepping into someone else's life. She ran her fingers through her shoulder-length brown hair, now free from the tight regulation bun she'd worn for years. The familiar sound of police sirens in the distance made her jump slightly, a reminder that some habits died hard. The doctors called it PTSD, but to Nancy, it was just the price of serving her country. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mom. "Don't forget about dinner tonight, sweetie. Dad's making his famous meatloaf." Nancy smiled despite herself. Her parents had been trying so hard to help her adjust to civilian life, even if they didn't quite understand what she was going through. Walking into her living room, she passed the wall where her military awards hung, medals and commendations that felt like they belonged to a different person now. Her security consultant badge lay on the coffee table next to a stack of bills that seemed to grow taller every day. The job at Phoenix Shield Security wasn't what she'd imagined doing after the military, but it paid the bills. Most days involved checking surveillance systems at local businesses or training new guards. A far cry from leading tactical operations in Kandahar. But it was honest work, and some days there had to be enough. Her morning coffee was interrupted by the chatter of kids walking to school outside her window. Their carefree laughter made her think about her own journey, how at their age, she'd dreamed of serving her country, of making a difference. Now, at 32, she wondered if she'd made any difference at all. The TV hummed quietly in the background, another news report about political tensions and global conflicts. Nancy changed the channel. After seeing the real cost of war up close, the talking heads on TV felt hollow, disconnected from the reality she knew. Her younger sister had invited her to a local veterans support group, but Nancy hadn't gone yet. The thought of sharing her experiences with strangers made her uncomfortable, even if they were fellow veterans. Some memories were better left in Afghanistan, locked away with the dog tags she kept in her bedside drawer. Getting ready for work, she pulled on her black security uniform, straightening the collar out of habit. Her hands moved automatically to where her military patches used to be, finding only blank fabric instead. The morning routine was different now. No more dawn PT sessions or morning briefings, just a quiet apartment and a commute through Phoenix traffic. As she grabbed her car keys, her phone buzzed again. This time it was her old squad mate checking in from Texas. "Hanging in there, Thompson," the message read. A simple question that carried the weight of shared experiences. They'd been through hell together, and now they were all trying to figure out this civilian life thing, one day at a time. The drive to work gave her time to think. About the friends she'd lost overseas. About the life she'd imagined for herself. About the country she'd served and how different everything looked now that she was home. The desert landscape of Phoenix sometimes reminded her of Afghanistan, but here the battles were different, fighting paperwork instead of enemies, battling memories instead of threats. But something inside her knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter. She might not wear the uniform anymore, but that sense of duty, that desire to serve and protect, it was still there, burning as bright as ever. She just needed to figure out how to use it in this new life she was building, one piece at a time. The call came in just as Nancy was finishing her lunch break at Phoenix Shield Security. Her supervisor's voice had that urgent tone she remembered from her military days, the kind that meant plans were about to change fast. "Thompson, I need you at the Royal Palm Resort tonight," he said, not bothering with small talk. That head of security called in sick, and they're hosting some big charity event. Need someone with your experience to handle it. Nancy's fork paused halfway to her mouth. The Royal Palm was the fanciest hotel in Phoenix, where rooms cost more per night than her monthly rent. She'd driven past it countless times, but never set foot inside. "Sir, I'm not scheduled for evening shifts this week. I've got family dinner." Double overtime pay, he cut in. "Plus, this could lead to more high-profile assignments if you play it right." The client specifically asked for someone with military background. Her mind went to that stack of bills on her coffee table, to the car repairs she'd been putting off. Sometimes life had a way of making decisions for you. What time do they need me? 4 o'clock. Formal security attire. I'll email you the details. The line went dead before she could ask more questions. Typical. Nancy called her mom to cancel dinner, promising to make it up next week. The disappointment in her mother's voice made her chest tight, but Judy called. Some habits never changed. Back at her apartment, she pulled out the formal security uniform she rarely used: black blazer, crisp white shirt, dress pants. As she got dressed, she caught herself running through pre-mission checks in her head, just like before patrol in Afghanistan. Funny how some routines stuck with you. The Royal Palm Resort loomed ahead as she pulled into the staff parking lot, its modern glass facade reflecting the late afternoon sun. A valet gave her a curious look as she showed her security badge, probably used to seeing the regular team. Inside, she met with the event coordinator, a stressed-looking woman named Linda who talked faster than a machine gun. "We've got over 300 guests coming, including several VIPs," she explained, flipping through pages on her clipboard. "The main ballroom needs constant monitoring, plus all entry points and the VIP areas. Your team has already been briefed." Nancy nodded, taking mental notes. In some ways, this wasn't so different from coordinating patrol routes. Keep the perimeter secure, watch for suspicious activity, maintain radio contact. Simple enough. But as she toured the venue, something felt off. The regular security team seemed on edge, exchanging glances when they thought she wasn't looking. The hotel manager kept checking his phone, pacing the hallways. There was something they weren't telling her. During the security briefing, she studied the floor plans, noting the escape routes and potential blind spots. Her team for the night included 6 regular hotel security guards and 2 additional contractors like herself. Good people, but she could tell most of them had never handled anything bigger than a rowdy wedding party. "Remember," she told them, falling into her old sergeant voice, "we're here to be professional and invisible. Any concerns, radio me immediately. Don't try to handle VIP issues alone." They nodded, but she could see the nervous energy in their postures. As guests began arriving, Nancy patrolled the perimeter, checking in with her team at each post. Ladies in evening gowns and men in tuxedos filed in, the air thick with expensive perfume and the sound of forced laughter. This was definitely a different world from her usual assignments. She just finished her second sweep when her radio crackled. "Thompson, we need you at the service entrance," one of her guards called, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's a situation." Making her way through the back corridors, Nancy felt that familiar surge of adrenaline, her senses sharpening. Whatever this situation was, she'd handle it. She'd faced down insurgents in Afghanistan. How bad could a charity event be? But as she rounded the corner toward the service entrance, she had no idea she was about to walk into a moment that would change everything. Sometimes the biggest surprises came not from what you were prepared for, but from what you never saw coming. The service entrance corridor was quieter than Nancy expected. Her footsteps echoed against the polished floor as she approached, one hand instinctively near her radio. Years of military training had taught her to expect anything, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. As she rounded the corner, she nearly collided with someone coming from the opposite direction. Her security training kicked in automatically, hands up, ready stance, quick assessment of the situation. Then her brain caught up with her eyes, and time seemed to stop. Standing right in front of her, straightening his signature red tie, was the former President of the United States. For a split second, neither of them moved. Nancy's mind raced through protocols for high-profile guest encounters, but somehow none of them covered literally bumping into a former president in a back hallway. "Sir, I apologize," she started, her military bearing taking over. "Are you all right? Where is your security detail?" The last question came out before she could stop herself. The security professional in her couldn't help but notice he was alone. The former president seemed equally surprised, but then his face broke into an unexpected smile. "They're probably having a heart attack right about now," he chuckled. "I needed a minute away from all the handshaking. You military?" Nancy blinked, caught off guard by the casual tone. "Yes, sir. Army, 6 years." The words came automatically, like they had in countless job interviews since coming home. He nodded, studying her face with unexpected intensity. "Let me guess. Afghanistan." When she nodded, his expression changed subtly. "Tough place." Saw it myself a few times. Never quite the same after you've been there, are you? Before Nancy could respond, her radio crackled. Thompson, status check. She quickly responded, situation secure, stand by. Her mind was spinning. This had to be why everyone had been so nervous earlier, why the regular security team had seemed on edge. Thompson, the former president, repeated, as if memorizing it. You know, you're the first person tonight who hasn't tried to take a selfie or pitch me a business idea. He glanced down the quiet hallway, then back at her. Got a few minutes to talk. Nancy's training screamed at her to radio for backup, to follow proper VIP protocols. But something in his expression made her pause. This wasn't the larger-than-life figure from TV. This was just a person standing in a quiet hallway, asking for a real conversation. She could hear the party in full swing through the walls. Clinking glasses, laughter, the muffled sound of the live band. Somewhere in the building, his security team was probably already searching for him. This moment wouldn't last long. Yes, sir, she heard herself say. I have a few minutes. He gestured to a small sitting area nearby, away from the main traffic flow. Good. You know, some of my most interesting conversations happen in places like this, away from all the cameras and speeches. As they walked to the sitting area, Nancy noticed things the TV cameras never showed. How he walked with a slight favor to his right leg, how his eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, a habit she recognized from her own combat training. How he seemed more relaxed here in this back hallway than in any public appearance she ever seen. Her radio crackled again with another security check. She responded professionally, but her mind was already racing ahead. Whatever was about to happen, she knew this wasn't going to be any ordinary conversation. The former president settled into one of the chairs, loosening his tie slightly. So, Thompson, he said, his voice dropping into a more serious tone, tell me what it's really like out there for our veterans, not the official reports, the truth. Nancy took a deep breath. After years of keeping her thoughts to herself, of trying to fit back into civilian life without making waves, she suddenly found herself with an unexpected audience. And somehow, in this quiet corner of a luxury hotel, she knew she was about to have the most important conversation of her life. The hallway suddenly felt both too small and too large at the same time. Nancy stood there, her security training fighting with her surprise, as the former president gestured to a nearby sitting area. Join me for a moment, he said, his voice different from what she'd heard on TV, softer, more conversational. Her radio crackled with a routine check-in. All clear in Sector 3, she responded automatically, then added, taking a brief break. The security team would manage without her for a few minutes. They sat in 2 plush armchairs tucked away in a quiet corner. Nancy noticed how the former president seemed more relaxed here, away from the cameras and crowds. He leaned forward slightly, his expression curious. How long did you serve? 6 years, sir. 3 tours in Afghanistan, Nancy replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. She'd rehearsed this simple information countless times at job interviews, but this felt different. Afghanistan, he nodded, his face growing serious. Tough place. Tougher people who served there. What unit? As Nancy mentioned her unit, his eyes lit up with recognition. I visited your base once, he said, then proceeded to describe details about the layout that only someone who'd been there would know. That mess hall had the best apple pie I've ever had in my life, he added with a small laugh. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily after that. They talked about the challenges veterans faced coming home, the paperwork battles with the VA, the struggle to translate military skills to civilian jobs, the friends who still carried invisible wounds from their service. You know, he said, reaching for a notepad from his jacket pocket, I meet a lot of veterans, but most of them tell me what they think I want to hear. You're different. You're direct, honest about the problems. Nancy thought about holding back, but something made her continue. So, with respect, there's a lot of talk about helping veterans, but the reality on the ground is different. My friend waited 8 months for a mental health appointment. Another couldn't get a job because employers didn't understand how her combat experience could help their company. Instead of becoming defensive, the former president listened intently, occasionally jotting notes. He shared stories about veterans he'd met across the country, revealing a side of him rarely seen in media coverage. He talked about private conversations with military families, moments that never made the headlines. People think I don't remember names or faces, he said, but I remember every Gold Star family I've met. Every letter from a veteran struggling to get care. These aren't just statistics to me. Then he mentioned something that caught Nancy completely off guard. We're actually working on something new, he said, lowering his voice slightly. A private initiative, partnering with major companies to create veteran-specific jobs and healthcare programs. Not government, too much red tape. Private sector, where we can move fast. He described the program in detail, how it would provide direct pathways to employment, mental health support without VA waitlists, and even housing assistance for veterans in transition. It's not public yet, he added, but I'd like you to be part of it. Nancy found herself sharing ideas she'd had about improving veteran support systems, thoughts she'd previously only shared with fellow service members. To her surprise, the former president took more notes, asking specific questions about implementation. This is exactly why I do these events, he said, checking his watch reluctantly. Everyone out there wants to talk politics and headlines. But these conversations, these are what matter. Real people, real solutions. As their time drew to a close, he wrote down a name and number. My assistant will contact you about the initiative. We need people like you involved, people who understand both sides and aren't afraid to speak up. Standing up, Nancy felt strangely light, as if some invisible weight had shifted. The former president extended his hand, and as they shook, he said something that stuck with her. You know, sometimes the best way to honor our service is to keep serving, just in a different way. Just then, his security detail rounded the corner, looking relieved to find him. As they escorted him back to the main event, he turned back briefly. Remember what I said, Thompson, we're not done making a difference. Nancy watched him disappear down the hallway, her mind already racing with possibilities. The conversation had lasted maybe 20 minutes, but something fundamental had shifted in her understanding, not just of him, but of her own path forward. The next morning felt surreal to Nancy as she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the business card the former president had given her. The events of the previous night played through her mind like a movie she wasn't sure she actually watched. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. Her heart jumped as she answered. Miss Thompson, this is Patricia Wilson from the President's office. He asked me to contact you about the Veterans Future Initiative. Nancy grabbed a pen, her military training kicking in as she took detailed notes. The program was bigger than she'd imagined. Major corporations had already committed billions in private funding. Tech companies were creating special training programs. Hospital networks were setting aside resources specifically for veteran care. We're looking at a soft launch next month, Patricia explained, her voice carrying the same enthusiasm Nancy had heard in the president's tone. But here's what makes this different. It's being designed by veterans, for veterans. That's why he wants you involved. As Patricia laid out the details, Nancy's mind went to her friend Mike, who'd been struggling to find work despite his advanced technical training from the Army, to Jenny, who'd missed her daughter's birthday because of a delayed VA appointment, to countless others who'd fallen through the cracks of the system. The president mentioned your ideas about peer support networks, Patricia continued. We'd like you to help develop that component. Your experience with both military and civilian life makes you ideal for this role. Nancy found herself walking around her apartment as they talked, too energized to sit still. This wasn't just another government program with endless paperwork and bureaucratic delays. This was something new, immediate, practical help for people who'd served. After the call, she opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The president's team had sent preliminary documents about the initiative. The scope was breathtaking. Job training programs tailored to military specialties, housing assistance that actually covered real-world costs, mental health support without the usual red tape. Her phone buzzed again, a text from her mom. You seemed different on the phone this morning. Everything okay? Nancy smiled, realizing she probably sounded more animated than she had in months. She started making notes, drawing from her own transition struggles. The program needed to address the little things nobody talked about, like how to handle a civilian workplace's different chain of command, or what to wear when you didn't have a uniform telling you exactly what was appropriate. Around noon, her supervisor called. Word had gotten out about her conversation with the former president. "Thompson, what exactly happened last night?" he asked, a mix of curiosity and concern in his voice. As she explained, carefully avoiding confidential details, she could hear the shift in his tone. This wasn't just about a security assignment anymore. This was about creating real change. Later that afternoon, she visited her local veterans center, seeing it with new eyes. The tired-looking folks in the waiting room, the overwhelmed staff doing their best with limited resources, soon they'd have better options. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from Patricia's team, documents to review, meetings to schedule, ideas to consider. It was overwhelming, but in a good way, like the feeling before a vital mission when you knew exactly what needed to be done. That evening, as she finally sat down to rest, Nancy looked at the wall where her military awards hung. For the first time in months, they didn't feel like relics of a past life. Instead, they felt like stepping stones to something new. Her sister called, picking up on the change in her voice immediately. "You sound different," she said. "What's going on?" Nancy smiled, thinking about how to explain it. "Remember how you said everything happens for a reason? How sometimes the worst moments lead you to exactly where you need to be?" She glanced at her laptop, still open to the program documents. "I think I finally understand what you meant. Sometimes the best way to heal isn't to move on from your past, it's to use it to help others move forward." The last light of day filtered through her window as she continued working, her mind full of possibilities. The initiative would be announced soon, but for now, she had work to do. Real, meaningful work that could change lives. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly ready for the mission ahead. News travels fast in the digital age, and by the next evening, Nancy's encounter at the Royal Palm Resort had become the talk of the town. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications as the story spread through local veteran groups and social media. "Is it true?" texted her old Army buddy Pete. "You actually had a one-on-one with the former president?" Before she could respond, 3 more messages popped up from other veterans she knew, all asking similar questions. At work, things had shifted too. Her supervisor called her into his office first thing in the morning, looking both impressed and slightly nervous. "The hotel management specifically requested you for their upcoming events," he said, shuffling through some papers. "They were very impressed with how you handled everything last night." Walking through the security office, Nancy noticed the whispers and glances from her co-workers. Some seemed impressed, others skeptical. "Must be nice having friends in high places now," one of the older guards mumbled as she passed. She pretended not to hear him. During her lunch break, Nancy sat in her car, needing a moment of quiet. Her mom had called twice already, having heard the news from her bridge club. "The whole neighborhood's talking about it, honey," she'd exclaimed. "Mrs. Wilson next door wants to know if you can put in a good word for her nephew's business." The local news had somehow gotten wind of the story too. A reporter waited outside the security office, hoping to get a comment. Nancy slipped out the back entrance, remembering her training about avoiding unwanted attention. Some things were better kept private. But not everything about the attention was negative. Her inbox filled with messages from fellow veterans sharing their stories, their struggles, their hopes. One email particularly touched her. "I didn't believe in change anymore," wrote a former Marine. "But hearing about your conversation, about someone actually listening to a regular vet, maybe there's hope after all." That evening, she visited her favorite diner, the same one she'd been going to since coming home. The usual waitress, Betty, brought her coffee without asking. "I saw the news," she said, smiling warmly. "You know, my son's in the Navy. It means a lot, knowing someone's actually fighting for veterans up there." Nancy stirred her coffee, thinking about how one conversation had created such ripples. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Patricia Wilson about the initiative. The plans were moving forward faster than expected, driven by the unexpected publicity. Back home, she found a small group of reporters outside her apartment building. One stepped forward as she approached. "Ms. Thompson, can you comment on your meeting with the former president? Is it true he's launching a new veteran program?" She paused, remembering his words about making a difference. "All I can say is this. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when we stop talking at each other and start listening to each other." Inside her apartment, she opened her laptop to find her email flooded with messages from veteran organizations across the country. Some offered support, others wanted information, and a few expressed skepticism about any real change happening. Her sister called, always the voice of reason in chaos. "How are you handling all this attention?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Nancy looked at the wall where her military photos hung, thinking about how much had changed in just 2 days. "It's strange," she admitted. "I didn't ask for any of this. I was just doing my job, having an honest conversation." As night fell, she sat on her small balcony, watching the city lights. Her phone kept buzzing, but she let it be for a moment. The weight of expectations, from fellow veterans, from the media, from herself, felt heavy on her shoulders. But then she remembered something her old commanding officer used to say: "Pressure is just responsibility in disguise." She had a chance to make real change happen, to help bridge the gap between veterans and the support they needed. A text came in from Pete: "Whatever happens next, we got your six." Simple words that meant everything. In the military, they'd learned that no mission succeeds alone. Maybe this new mission would work the same way, one step at a time, one story at a time, one change at a time. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more attention, more challenges. But for now, Nancy Thompson, former soldier and accidental catalyst for change, allowed herself a small smile. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest moments, like a chance encounter in a hotel hallway. 6 months had passed since that fateful night at the Royal Palm Resort. Nancy stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces, veterans, business leaders, and media representatives gathered for the official launch of the Veterans Future Initiative. The conference room at the Phoenix Convention Center hummed with energy. In the front row, she spotted familiar faces, her parents beaming with pride, her sister giving her a thumbs up, and several veterans she'd served with, all dressed in their best civilian attire. "When I left the military," she began, her voice steady, "I thought my days of making a difference were over. Funny how life proves you wrong sometimes." A knowing chuckle rippled through the crowd. The past months had been a whirlwind. The initiative had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Over 50 major companies had signed on, creating specialized veteran hiring programs. 20 hospital networks had dedicated resources to veteran care. Housing assistance programs were already helping hundreds of families. But the real success stories sat right there in the audience. She spotted Pete, now working as a technical trainer at a major software company, one of the initiative's first success stories. Behind him sat Lynn, a former medic who'd finally gotten the support she needed to open her own physical therapy practice. "This isn't about handouts," Nancy continued, remembering her own struggles. "It's about opportunities. About recognizing that military experience isn't a barrier to civilian success, it's an advantage." The screens behind her showed photos from the past 6 months. Veterans starting new jobs, families moving into homes, support groups meeting for the first time. Real people, real changes, real hope. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably another message from Patricia Wilson. They'd become close friends through all this, working late nights to make everything happen. The former president had kept his word, staying personally involved and opening doors that had previously been sealed shut. "Someone once told me that sometimes the best way to honor our service is to keep serving, just in a different way," she said, remembering that conversation in the hotel hallway. "At first, I didn't understand what that meant. Now I do." The initiative's office downtown had become a second home. Veterans dropped in daily, not just for help, but to offer their own support to others. The walls were covered with success stories, photos of first days at new jobs, keys to new homes, families reunited. Last week, a young veteran came to our office, Nancy shared, her voice softening. He'd been sleeping in his car for 3 months, too proud to ask for help. Today, he's in an apartment, starting a new job, and most importantly, he's got hope again. The room fell silent, everyone remembering their own struggles or those of someone they knew. This wasn't just about programs and policies anymore, it was about people helping people. "The military taught us never to leave anyone behind," she continued. "That doesn't stop when we take off the uniform. If anything, it becomes even more important." After the speech during the reception, Nancy found a quiet moment to step outside. The Arizona sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. She thought about how different everything felt now compared to just 6 months ago. Her security consultant badge still hung on her wall at home, a reminder of where this journey started. But now she had a new mission, a new purpose. The nightmares about Afghanistan still came sometimes, but they didn't hold the same power over her. A group of veterans approached her, eager to share their stories and ideas. Each conversation reinforced what she'd learned, that real change happens one person at a time, one story at a time, one day at a time. Later that evening, as she drove home, Nancy thought about that unexpected encounter that had changed everything. Sometimes the biggest transformations came from the smallest moments: a chance meeting, an honest conversation, a willingness to listen and be heard. Her phone lit up with a message from the former president. "Watched your speech online. This is just the beginning. Keep leading the way." She smiled, thinking about how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. The stars were coming out as she parked at her apartment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, Nancy Thompson, veteran turned advocate, felt at peace with her place in the world. Sometimes life's greatest surprises led to exactly where you needed to be all along.